director Lucifer Valentine.
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 Lucifer Valentine, also known as the father of vomit gore, is the exploitation horror alter ego of one Sean Fedorchuk, a Canadian underground filmmaker. You might have heard about him or are perhaps familiar with his rather infamous work. Valentine began gaining attention in 2006 with the release of Slaughtered Vomit Dolls, a low-budget experimental feature with non-linear narrative and recurring motifs of bulimia, vomiting, and violence. His approach to horror was unconventional back then, and even for today's standards. He has stated in interviews that he rarely uses full screenplays, and instead works from loose concepts, visual ideas, or improvised scenarios. His films are characterized by fragmented narratives, an experimental editing style, and recurring symbolic themes that mix physical objection, especially vomiting, with spiritual, satanic, or metaphysical works. He has alleged inspiration and influence from the underground horror scene, exploitation cinema, noise music, and the human experience of trauma. Valentine himself frequently blends autobiography with performative myth-making, claiming his work as both an expression of personal pain and a deliberate provocation of what is acceptable and what is taboo. That is what he says, at least. What I think, however, is that experimental trauma exploitation can only get you so far. And the Valentine filmography is a clear example of a tasteless sadist making content for others equally as perverted, or perhaps just simple thrill seekers, prostituting art as torture porn for the morbidly curious.
Sorry, I just want to take a bit of a look at you.
Lucifer Valentine's first feature was the 2006 Slaughtered Vomit Dolls. The film opens up not with any exposition or any semblance of a plot, but with degrading imagery centered around the protagonist, Angela Everdeen. There's handheld shots, distorted voices, and flashing filters with no anchor, no where or when.
Who are you? My name is Blisters.
Early sequences introduce Angela as both narrator and subject, though her voice is fragmented and often overlaid with static or echoes. It's almost like Valentine didn't care for her as a character, but rather as the vessel and receiver of whatever distorted message of violence and extreme porn he wanted to convey. She recounts pieces of her life, but this backstory is filtered through grime. Immediately, Valentine goes right into vomiting. Close-ups of regurgitation, often in slow motion, that are intercut with faces and bodies in pain. These images function less as plot points and more as recurring symbols. Angela is the thorough line, though her presence shifts between diegetic character and symbolic image. Some scenes show her in a bedroom, sobbing or vomiting alone. Others cut to ritualistic tableau, masked figures, blood-soaked bodies, and demonic imagery that blur whether these are hallucinations, memories, or fantasies. Angela is often framed as both victim and participant. The editing is aggressively non-linear. Cuts come fast, over repeating the same shots at different speeds or with filter layers over them. Visual distortions, just color inversion, static, and flickering strobes is constant, creating a sense of disorientation and, in my opinion, cheapness masked as experimentalism. What some viewers describe it fittingly as visual vomit. The film does not build towards a climax. This Gotten movie doesn't go anywhere but in circles. Instead, the repetition intensifies, vomiting becomes more frequent, voices more distorted, cuts are more frantic, and the exploitation of this main character reaches an unbearable point. The final passages function less as resolution and more like total sensory overload, leaving the viewer disoriented rather than satisfied. Slaughtered Vomit Dolls was independently released, obviously. Primarily distributed on DVD by underground labels and through horror specialty outlets. Its notoriety spread through word of mouth in extreme horror communities, where it was positioned alongside other boundary-pushing films like August Underground or the Japanese Guinea Pig series. It was incoherent, exploitative, and artistically bankrupt. And movies like that are oftentimes praised for being avant-garde and boundary-breaking by those who want to justify their enjoyment of female exploitation. Within the niche of trashy gorehounds, it secured about Within the niche of trashy gorehounds, it secured Valentine a cult following and a launchpad for his filmmaking career. 2 years later, Valentine made Regurgitated Sacrifice, released in 2008 through Unearthed Films. He described it not as a sequel in the traditional sense, but as a second hallucination in the Angela Everdeen saga. While Slaughtered Vomit Dolls introduced Angela as a runaway, Regurgitated Sacrifice dives deeper into her psychological and spiritual breakdown, framed as a ritualistic journey through death, possession, and demonic realms. Like its predecessor, it was conceived without a traditional screenplay. Valentine constructed the film from fragments, improvised performances, and experimental editing. The film begins with harsh, disjointed visuals, static, flickering scenes, and a distorted audio that set the viewer in an unstable headspace. It was the Lucifer Valentine quote-unquote style, a lazy and hollow mirroring of what other experimental artists were doing at the time. Angela Everdeen is again present, narrating fragments of her trauma and disorders, though her voice is layered with echo and distortion, still an afterthought in her own exploitation. Of course, vomiting soon ensues. Angela is once again the focal point, but her role is even more abstract than before. She appears in cycles of humiliation, rituals, and violence, vomiting in slow motion, being strangled or bound, and subjected to assault by masked or faceless figures. The imagery cuts rapidly between her body and a symbolic tableau of horror slop, pentagrams, demons, ritual spaces. This film suggests her torment as part of a larger satanic or spiritual ritual, though it of course fails to comprehend whatever the hell it thinks it's doing. The editing in Regurgitated Sacrifice is even more aggressive than in Slaughtered Vomit Dolls. Like a little kid telling the joke louder because the first time he got a few laughs. Once again, there's no clear definition between the beginning of the movie and the end. The climax is not a single event, but a layering of vomiting, assault, ritual sacrifice, and distorted sound into a near unbearable barrage. The final sequences dissolve into abstraction, flickering faces, static, and bodily fluids blending into one another. This sequel quickly became notorious in extreme horror circles, perhaps even more than the first installment due to honing in to the shock factor, often cited as one of the most disturbing films ever made. Within the niche collectors of extreme cinema, it solidified Valentine's reputation even further. So, hanging on to this newfound recognition, Valentine made a third movie. Released in 2010, Slow Torture Puke Chamber was marketed as the conclusion to the Vomit Gore trilogy. By this point, Valentine had established himself in extreme horror subcultures as a director whose films prioritized bodily abjection, especially vomiting, over narrative, meaning he was sought after by audiences that more so looked for pornography rather than actual films. Slow Torture Puke Chamber, say that 5 times, pushed this approach even further, creating a film that is less about Angela Everdeen's fragmented biography and more about sustained sensory assault, but both for her and the viewer. The title itself signals the intent, a prolonged chamber of torture. Pretty sure he was running out of ideas by now and just made a long exploitation tape with harsh filters and noise music and called it art. The film opens abruptly, with distorted images of women screaming, vomiting, and being tortured. There is no setup or framing device, there is no plot. Angela Everdeen reappears, but she feels less like the central character like she was in Slaughtered Vomit Dolls or even Regurgitated Sacrifice, and she's more like a symbolic presence. Her voice, distorted and layered with static, narrates fragments of a story, but the focus is dispersed amongst multiple female figures, each subjected to violence. Unlike the first 2 films, which at least nod towards a narrative act, STPC is structured almost entirely as a series of tortures. The camera lingers not on plot but on sensation. Close-ups of convulsions, tears streaming, and blurred limbs thrashing. Valentine loops the footage until actions become repetitive gestures, cutscenes at disorienting points, and overlaying multiple images to create visual noise. The effect is to overwhelm the viewer's senses, denying the clarity of relief. More than either of the previous films, STPC is nothing more than an endurance test, or just garbage material for those who get off to exploitation, disguised as something avant-garde or misunderstood. By this point, Valentine's reputation would ensure that the film attracted the attention of collectors. Reception, however, was even more polarized than before. Admirers praised it as the most uncompromising entry in the trilogy, a work that fully embraced the experimental horror as pure sensory assault. Detractors, including many within the horror community, criticized it as monotonous, nihilistic, and devoid of any artistic progression. After finishing the Vomit Gore trilogy, Valentine had a change of heart and shifted to a documentary-style project, Black Metal Veins, that was released in 2012 by the same Unearthed Films, marketed as a real-life descent into hell, following heroin addicts who are also fans of black metal. The film abandons fictional characters in favor of real people, 5 addicts, whose daily life revolves around injecting heroin, panhandling, and listening to black metal. The camera, still with its shakiness and overuse of distortion, though a bit toned down, follows them as they shit up, argue, nod off, and talk about their lives. Arguably still profiting off of exploitation, but in a different way. Valentine applies his editing style, flashing lights, distorted audio, overlapping images, to real footage, turning the documentary into less of an informative piece and more of a sensationalizing, presumptuous attempt of showing audiences the underbelly of a real systematic problem. Intercut are clips of black metal performances, demonic imagery of course, and Valentine's usual motifs of death and abjection, self-serving in the worst possible ways, as the documentary never really allows the 5 addicts to go very far with their monologues before it's interrupting them with harsh visual effects and loud music. Reception was divided, even more so than with his original trilogy. Some praised it as a raw document of addiction akin to Christian F. or Burden of Dreams, filtered through Valentine's style. But it's because of that style that others condemned it as exploitative, arguing that he took vulnerable people and aestheticized their suffering. Of course, the audiences he catered the Vomit series to weren't as receptive to this documentary, exploitative as it still was, so it's one of his less recognized works. Of course, and perhaps because of this, A Perfect Child of Satan was released later the same year, a shorter feature of around 45 minutes that functions as a companion piece to the Vomit Gore trilogy. Intercut, of course, are the usual scenes of violence, vomiting, and demonic imagery, filmed in the same handheld style. Fans saw it as a worthwhile addition to Angela's mythology, more of what they wanted from Valentine, while detractors dismissed it as a rehash, because it was. It did not break any ground, but reinforced Valentine's focus on Angela as his reoccurring muse, not to say his cash cow. This gave way to, in 2015, an official return of the Vomit Gore series, with a 4th-entry titled Black Mass of the Nazi Sex Wizard. This dumpster fire of a film combines the familiar Angela Everdeen abusive imagery with Nazi occult references, as if to check even more boxes for those who think of their perversion as misunderstood appreciation for underground and transgressive art. It depicts satanic rituals, sexual violence, vomiting, and torture, framed within a loose narrative of Angela being ensnared in the rites of a Nazi sex wizard. The editing style mirrors earlier films, chaotic, fragmented, and heavy with distortion. Though in this movie, there is a sense of irony in it that his usual audiences didn't enjoy. It's as if it had finally dawned on him, on Valentine, that he wasn't seen as a filmmaker, but more like the showmaster of a pornographic freak show. So reception was largely negative, even within Valentine's fanbase. Many described it as a self-parody, recycling the same imagery without any innovation. Some collectors valued it for completeness, but most dismissed it just as repetitive and lacking any substance. The most recent addition to Valentine's body of work is the Angela Chapters, released in 2020, as both a pseudo-documentary and an anthology. It shows that Valentine sees himself as some sort of trailblazer in the extreme horror community, and to a certain extent, he is, but honestly for terrible reasons. This 2020 entry combines new footage with outtakes, re-edited scenes, and interviews related to Angela Everdeen's character, positioning itself as a retrospective of the Vomit Gore cycle. As the title suggests, it is more of a compilation, so showing unused or re-edited sequences from earlier films, framed by commentary and mockumentary-style inserts of the actors and the director. It portrays Angela not just as a character, but as a mythos that has spanned Valentine's career, of course with the background of constant vomiting. Some fans appreciated the Archibald approach, treating it as an opportunity to revisit the Angela mythology. Others criticized it once again as recycling content without adding much new. By 2020, Valentine's niche audience felt the formula was exhausted. But with the consistent rise of social media and the internet boom of especially the quarantine years, he found a new audience beyond his history of straight-to-DVD film.
Like, oh, I had a horrible childhood and blah, 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 and this is why you know what? I had a wonderful fucking childhood.
You did?
I had a great childhood. Very happy, family, blah, 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 blah.
In the early years of internet forums, Lucifer Valentine's name circulated mostly via niche horror discussions, underground DVD trading, and websites devoted to extreme cinema. At this stage, visibility was limited to people deeply interested in gore, splatter porn, or extreme transgressive art. But during the 2010s, and with the spread of Reddit and horror subreddits, especially r/horror, threads began to appear discussing Valentine's work, and also allegations about its production. One popular Reddit thread is titled Lucifer Valentine, maker of the Vomit Gore trilogy, accused of sexual assault, grooming, and child abuse. Who would have thought? These posts, in fact, increased exposure, especially amongst the younger horror audience, who follows controversial horror content, thinking that because of Valentine's style and his behaviors, his films would be particularly shocking to watch. And they weren't necessarily wrong. Subreddits like r/RBI also got involved in collecting anecdotal testimonies and discussing allegations and rumors about Valentine's behavior. For example, a thread titled quote-unquote follow-up, investigating Lucifer Valentine, lays out claims of how the director recruits participants via private Facebook or Instagram groups, alleged threats, and other behaviors observed by users. Nowadays, and with the rise of short-form content, both through older social medias like Facebook and Instagram, and with the rise of TikTok, Valentine's work has resurfaced as a form of shockbait.
This is the most disturbing, disgusting film that I have ever watched. After seeing some talk about it on TikTok, I thought I'd give it a go. I knew I wouldn't last long. I knew my stomach wouldn't be able to handle it, and I was right.
Don't watch this movie, you will regret it. I watched it, and I regret it.
This is probably the most disgusting trilogy you could ever watch. Now you're probably wondering yourself, Chris, why did you watch any of these? Well, I've been seeing it on TikTok, Twitter, and Reddit, so I figured I'd dive in and see what the hype is about.
Been trying to avoid this one, but everyone keeps asking for it, so let's take a look.
Shockbait is a term used for content designed to grab attention by being gross, disturbing, or offensive, often without much context. It works like clickbait, but instead of making you curious, it tries to shock you or disgust you so you can't look away. On TikTok, for example, this is done with clips from actual gore and snuff videos, as well as material like Lucifer Valentine's filmography. People who are into extreme horror often treat Valentine's work as a benchmark of how far horror can go, even if they haven't seen from his movies more than snippets or just summaries. At the same time, many in those communities question whether what they see is real, as newer viewers discover Lucifer Valentine's through clips rather than full films. Short moments of vomiting, ritual imagery, or extreme violence that get reposted or looped. Because full movies from Lucifer Valentine are hard to access, as they are still underground DVDs and its distribution is fairly controversial. So, short content has become the primary mode of familiarity new audiences have with Lucifer Valentine's works. This has allowed his name to be kind of revered in this mystical sort of transgressive director of artistic extreme violence, when in fact Lucifer Valentine is nothing more than a grifter that capitalized both from attention and the money that was available within communities that looked for violent and graphic pornography, trying and, in my opinion, failing to cement his style as anything other than disgusting gore slap. Violence in cinema, and in art more broadly, has always been a point of tension. From Renaissance paintings showing martyrdom and hellscapes to modern films that show very graphic death, the human imagination has consistently resorted to violent imagery. We may recoil from it, but we also recognize it as a part of how art reflects the psyche. Our fears, our mortality and our anger, our desires for justice or catharsis. Violence in art is rarely just about brutality for its own sake. At its best, it becomes a metaphor, a way of engaging with difficult truths about what it means to be human. Cinema, since its invention, has inherited this dual role. Early horror films like Nosferatu and Frankenstein were pretty horrifying at the time, and they used monsters as stand-in for the unknown or for social anxieties. This, of course, escalated quite a bit, and the exploitation cinema of the 1960s and 70s, whether it was Italian giallo, American grindhouse, or Japanese pinku films, went even further, putting blood, sexuality, and cruelty front and center. These works were often dismissed at their time, but many have since been reinterpreted as stylistically bold or subversively political. Films like Cannibal Holocaust, which was pretty controversial in its own way, or the Guinea Pig series that I mentioned before, have become test cases for how far cinema can go. They were accused of indecency, even prosecuted as obscenity, but they also sparked debates about censorship, realism, and the ethics of representation. The rise of extreme cinema in the late 20th and early 21st century made this question sharper. Directors like Gaspar Noé, Catherine Breillat, and Takashi Miike used violent imagery in ways that were undeniably difficult to watch, but were grounded in thematic intention. In these contexts, violence and extremity are in the service of artistic vision, however polarizing. But violence in art always trades a fine line between expression and exploitation. It can also devolve into a spectacle for its own sake, offering shock without substance. What separates the two is not always clear, and it often lies in intention, craft, and perspective, having an actual story to tell. Exploitation thrives when violence is presented as an end in itself, when the suffering of bodies, and often women's bodies, is commodified into a product for voyeuristic thrills. In that sense, exploitative cinema is not simply about gore or nudity or vomiting. It is about the flattening of human experience into cheap sensation and shock value. That, to me, is Lucifer Valentine. The moment gore trilogy and its follow-ups present themselves as surreal, transgressive art, but in practice, they amount to endless repetition of vomiting, degradation, and ritualized abuse for an audience that expects, intellectually, nothing more than pressure and thrill. There's no narrative arc, there's no thematic progression, no craft beyond shaky camera work and heavy editing filters. Angela Aberdeen's supposedly the tragic figure at the center of the films is less a character and more of a vessel for humiliation. The recurrence of vomiting is framed as metaphor, and yet it's simply fetish, as Valentine never develops it beyond the obvious. The result is not catharsis or confrontation with trauma, but voyeurism masquerading as art. The fanbase that has grown around these films, especially through online forums and now social media platforms like TikTok, is less about appreciating cinema and more about indulging in shockbait. Short clips of women vomiting, screaming, or being assaulted are circulated as proof of how extreme one's taste in horror is, functioning more like a dare than like engagement with art. And this is not new. The underground horror community has long traded tapes of so-called most disturbing films. Valentine's imagery has become fodder for simplistic thrill-seeking. The film's newfound popularity is not about artistic merit, but about audiences competing to show how much they can stomach. That is what makes Valentine's work ultimately shallow. He presents himself as an experimental visionary, but his films recycle the same motifs with little evolution. He leans onto the rhetoric of trauma, spirituality, and metaphysics, but does not translate those ideas into coherent or challenging cinema. They're rather points of justification he pulls out of his sleeve during interviews. Instead, he caters to the lowest common denominator of underground horror, the desire to see women vomit, suffer, and die on screen, endlessly repeated. Where other extreme directors, however controversial, embed the work in a tradition of confronting societal taboos, Valentine remains a grifter, an uninspired filmmaker who packages suffering as a spectacle for niche audiences. Violence in art is not going away, and nor should it, even in its more extreme forms. But for violence in cinema to mean something, to transcend its exploitative potential, it must be rooted in thought, in crafts, and in a genuine attempt to confront something. Shock without substance quickly loses power. Audiences may gasp, gag, recoil, but when the moment passes, it leaves them with nothing behind but the memory of disgust. That is where Lucifer Valentine ultimately fails as a filmmaker. He does not illuminate, he does not transport, he does not provoke reflection, he merely provokes a reflex. His work will likely continue to circulate as shockbait for curious viewers online, but as cinema, it stands as an example of how extremity without purpose becomes not transgressive but tedious. Violence in art may be eternal, but exploitation disguised as vision is always temporary.